It wasn't a dogfight, it was pure devastation. The sensation of the Corsair trembling in my hands is something I can still recall clearly. The aircraft responding with force, as yet another Japanese Zero erupted under my fire. Flames and smoke poured from the enemy plane as it twisted downward, trailing a thick, black spiral before vanishing into the endless blue of the Pacific 2,000 feet below. The sky above Okinawa, that morning, April 16, 1945, was consumed by chaos and violence. Death seemed to drift in the air like fog, and I was dealing it out with brutal efficiency 4.50 caliber machine guns, firing relentlessly. 600 rounds a minute, tearing through the sky. The radio crackled. Tally-ho enemy aircraft. At 2 o'clock low, came the voice of Lieutenant Tommy Morrison, my wingman. His tone was sharp and urgent. Without hesitation, we dropped into a steep dive, aiming for another cluster of Japanese planes climbing from the southern horizon. Far beneath us, the Allied fleet filled the ocean like a massive floating city of steel, warships stretching from one edge of the sea to the other, and the enemy was coming for it once again. Wave after wave, determined, unrelenting. I was Captain Jack Hamilton, though my squadron called me Hammer. I flew the F-4U Corsair with Marine Fighter Squadron, VMF 323. Known across the Pacific as the Death Rattlers. Our unit was stationed at Kadena Airfield on the island of Okinawa. By the time the campaign was over in June, we had witnessed an air war unlike anything history had ever seen. It wasn't just combat, it was systematic annihilation. Japanese air power in the Pacific was being wiped off the map. During that single campaign, over 2,000 enemy aircraft were eliminated. I personally downed 23 of them, sending each one crashing into the sea. But on that particular April morning, as I pulled into another steep dive, I had no idea I was flying into what would later be known as the most one-sided air slaughter in military history. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Sunday, a day usually marked by peace and rebirth. But this one was wrapped in the fire and steel of war. I'd been flying combat missions for 8 months by then, moving from one island to the next, alongside the Marines. We had faced resistance before, fierce and desperate, but nothing had prepared us for what Okinawa held in store. The island had been transformed into a fortress, natural terrain had become weapons. Every cave had been fortified, every hill reinforced, every small village turned into a stronghold. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dug in, each one sworn to fight to the death rather than surrender. What made Okinawa truly different, though, wasn't just the fierce defense on the ground. It was the new kind of storm that came from above. The Japanese had launched something terrifying and unprecedented, Operation Kaikasui, which roughly translates to floating chrysanthemum. It was a desperate but terrifyingly ambitious plan. The goal was clear: to sink as many American ships as possible through waves of suicide. Aircraft kamikazes. The Japanese military had pulled together every airframe they could get their hands on. Fighters, bombers, trainers, even biplanes from an earlier age. They crammed them with explosives and placed them in the hands of young, fanatical pilots who had accepted they would never come home. It wasn't until April 6 that the true magnitude of what we were up against became horrifyingly clear. I was leading a routine patrol for Corsairs flying at 15,000 feet just north of the landing beaches. The sky was calm, but beneath that, quiet loomed something terrible. Then the calm shattered. The radar operator's voice burst through the radio. All units, vampire, vampire, vampire. Large hostile formation approaching from the north. Heading 090, altitude 12,000 feet. Numerous enemy aircraft inbound. The code word vampire sent a chill through every pilot. It meant suicide attackers were on the way. My heart pounded as I shoved the throttle forward. The Corsair roared in response, its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine bursting into full power with a sound that was more like an earthquake than a machine. The GI force shoved me back into the seat as we began our steep climb to intercept the threat. Seconds later, another voice broke in. Death Rattler leader. This is command. We're tracking more than 350 enemy aircraft headed toward the fleet. Intercept immediately. Weapons free. My eyes widened. 350 enemy planes in a single wave. I'd never heard of anything like it. The size of it was staggering. As we raced toward the intercept point, the sky began to fill with other American fighters. Corsairs like ours, Hellcats from Navy carriers, and a few of the brand new P-51 Mustangs from the Army Air Forces. They converged from all sides. I glanced toward Morrison's aircraft. Do you see that? His voice was tight with anxiety. I followed his finger and felt a cold weight settle in my chest. The northern sky was blackened by aircraft, a massive, disorganized swarm of Japanese planes moving steadily toward our ships. There were so many. The horizon itself looked like it was being swallowed. There must be hundreds, came a stunned whisper from Billy Chen, our youngest pilot flying in the third slot. He sounded like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I took a deep breath, trying to hide the nerves, shaking my fingers as they clutched the controls. I pressed the radio button. Stay focused, everyone. Reinforcements are coming. We're not letting them reach the fleet. Let's remind them who we are. My voice was steadier than I felt, but I had to keep the squadron together. We were about to face something overwhelming. At exactly 13:47 hours, we made contact. The battle exploded. We dove into the enemy formation like wolves tearing through a helpless herd. But these targets weren't defenseless. They came ready to take us with them. I locked on to a Ki-43 Oscar, one of the nimble Japanese fighters escorting bombers filled with explosives. As we sped toward each other in a head-on approach, I saw the pilot clearly. His face, his white headband beneath the brown leather of his flying helmet. He wasn't turning. He wasn't flinching. At 400 yards, I opened fire. The Corsair trembled as all four of my guns blazed together, spitting a relentless stream of bullets into the Oscar's nose. The round struck home, and the fighter simply came apart, shattered metal and canvas bursting outward. The pilot's body flung from the cockpit like a ragdoll in a storm. One down, I called over the radio, already swinging toward another target. But it was like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. There were too many. For every plane we knocked out of the sky, several more surged in to take its place. They came in layers. First, the fighter escorts, clearing the way, then the bombers, their bellies full of death. And finally, the kamikazes, suicide attackers of every shape and size. I saw ancient training aircraft held together by wires. Their young pilots barely old enough to shave, flying straight into the heart of our defenses. I saw skilled enemy aces piloting advanced fighters, twisting and spinning through the battle like ghosts. I saw overloaded bombers struggling to stay airborne, so packed with explosives that they flew with difficulty. Yet they still came on, unwavering in their deadly mission. Their pilots were relentless, intent on reaching our naval forces no matter the cost. Hammer, break right. Morrison's voice snapped through my headset just in time. A zero had slipped onto my sixth end. I suddenly felt the jarring impact of 20mm cannon fire pounding into the Corsair's armored fuselage. I yanked the control stick hard to the right and dropped into a steep dive, using the aircraft's superior speed to break free. Once I had some distance, I pulled into a steep climb, flipping the engagement. The enemy pilot was no rookie. He managed to stay with me through the first part of the maneuver, but the Corsair's strength was its raw power and speed. In the vertical climb, I quickly gained the upper hand. I performed a hammerhead turn, stalled at the top, kicked the rudder, and dropped back down onto him from above. This time I didn't miss. My guns tore into his cockpit, and the Zero flipped over and plunged straight down, trailing flames and smoke until it disappeared beneath the waves. Second kill, I reported, though my focus had already moved to the next threat. The battle in the sky went on for more than 3 hours. We kept bringing enemy planes down until every last round of ammunition was gone. Then we landed at Kadena, quickly reloaded and refueled, and returned to the skies to meet another wave of incoming aircraft. It felt endless, like trying to drain the sea with a spoon. By the time darkness fell, we had downed more than 250 enemy planes in one day. The waters around Okinawa were strewn with debris sections of wings, engines, fuselages, and the bodies of pilots drifting in the surf. Our losses were surprisingly few. Only 3 American fighters had been brought down, and 2 of those pilots were successfully recovered. But the Japanese didn't stop. They returned after sundown, when things became even more dangerous. Night attacks were terrifying. During daylight, radar gave us a chance to respond early, to catch them before they reached our ships. But under the cover of darkness, skimming just above the ocean surface, enemy aircraft could approach nearly undetected until they were already upon the fleet. I had been assigned to one of the first groups flying F-4U-2 Corsairs modified with radar, an early experiment in night combat. Flying in the dark felt like chasing shadows. You relied completely on a dim radar display and the soft, guiding voice of a ground controller to track your target. On the night of April 12th, I was alone in the air at 8,000 feet, scanning the void when my radar operator, Corporal Mike Scope Kowalski, called out, "Hammer, we've got a contact 2 o'clock, 4 miles out, 500 feet altitude, headed straight for the ships." I banked in that direction, squinting into the endless black below. The moon was buried behind clouds, and the only light came from the faint, glowing trails behind our fleet's wake. Flying at night felt like floating inside a bottomless pit. No horizon, no landmarks. Just the steady hum of instruments and your faith in the screen in front of you. "Target closing 2 miles, Kowalski said again. "Still low? Still inbound." I pushed the throttle forward and dropped the nose, trying to gain a better angle. Night engagements were slow and deliberate. You had to be certain you were tracking an enemy, but you couldn't get too close too soon. If the target spotted you, the element of surprise was gone. 1 mile Hammer, you should be able to see him now. I searched ahead, my eyes straining. Then I saw it, just a faint shape darker than the surrounding sky. The outline of a Japanese bomber gliding low above the ocean. It was a Betty, a Mitsubishi J4Mi, likely carrying a full load of explosives. Its course led straight to our aircraft carriers. I crept in behind and below, close enough to see the dull flicker of its engines, but far enough to avoid detection. The pilot had no idea I was there. He flew steadily, unaware that I was tracking his every move. At 200 yards, I opened fire. Tracer rounds lit up the night like streaks of fire, tearing into the bomber's fuselage. Instantly, flames erupted from the wings and body, turning the night sky into a blinding flash of orange. But the Betty didn't go down. The plane, engulfed in fire, kept flying directly toward our fleet. Now just a flying bomb set alight. "He's still flying," I shouted into the mic. "Burning Betty, heading for the ships." I chased him, pulling the trigger again and again, ripping more holes through the wings and fuselage. Debris scattered in all directions. But still the bomber flew on. Lower now, losing altitude but staying on its deadly path. Then, maybe 100 feet above the waves, one of its wings snapped. The aircraft flipped violently and slammed into the sea, erupting in a fireball that lit up the horizon. The shockwave rocked my Corsair, even from nearly a mile away. "One Betty down," I called in, my voice unsteady. The thought of that burning wreck reaching our ships, especially a carrier full of aviation fuel and ordnance, was chilling. That was every night fighter's fear. The one you couldn't stop. The one that broke through and took hundreds of lives in a single instant. By May 1945, the collapse of Japanese air power was becoming a clear reality. Reports came in daily: massive engagements, scores of enemy planes shot down, airfields across the Pacific region pounded into useless craters. I had been flying back-to-back combat missions for over a month. The toll was obvious. My hands trembled. When I was grounded, I'd lost weight. Sleep brought no rest, only visions of the young men I'd seen fall from the sky. Some of those pilots couldn't have been older than 18, thrown into battle in fragile aircraft with barely any training. Still, the attacks didn't stop. Even with their air force in ruins, they kept launching more planes. Many were outdated or never meant for combat trainer aircraft, civilian planes, even gliders packed with explosives. It felt like an entire country had decided to go down in flames rather than admit defeat. On May 25th, I scored my 23rd and final aerial victory of the Okinawa campaign. It was a Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, flown by a skilled and experienced opponent. He had already taken out 2 of our bombers and was turning to strike a third when I intercepted him during a climb. What followed was one of the longest fights I ever had in the air: nearly 10 minutes of tight turns, sudden dives, and every evasive tactic in the book. He was sharp, knew his machine, and nearly got the upper hand more than once. But the Corsair's speed, armor, and firepower eventually turned the tide. In a head-on pass, I lined him up and let loose a burst that sheared off his entire left wing. The Tony spiraled down and exploded into the hills of southern Okinawa. I watched the fire from the crash burn below and felt no thrill, no pride, only wariness, only the deep, aching knowledge of how much had been lost for us, for them, for everyone. How many boys had met their end in the clouds above Okinawa, and how many more would fall before this conflict finally reached its conclusion? The numbers were overwhelming. In the 82 days it took to secure Okinawa, over 2,000 enemy aircraft had been wiped out, destroyed in dogfights, demolished on the ground, or lost in suicide missions. The Japanese had thrown every remaining resource into the fight, and we had taken it all down. American aircraft losses were far fewer, under 200 total, from all causes. But the emotional weight was massive. We had witnessed the absolute collapse of a nation's air force, seen a whole generation of aviators perish in hopeless charges against superior forces. The battle officially ended on June 21, 1945, though I had been sent back home 2 weeks earlier. My record stood at 127 combat sorties flown, 23 enemy planes downed, and honors, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in action. But none of those decorations compared to the simple fact that I had survived. As the transport plane climbed away from Kadena for the last time, I glanced down at the island that had soaked up so much blood. It was a shattered place, burned, broken, littered with craters, and wreckage from countless aircraft. In the harbor, American ships bore the marks of countless kamikaze strikes. Some had sunk, some limped onward with damage, but all had kept fighting. Taking apart Japan's air force in that battle had been a clear success, but one that came with a terrible price. Over 12,000 Americans had died, and more than 36,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties were staggering: over 100,000 soldiers and civilians were killed, and their air force as a combat unit was essentially wiped out. Yet perhaps the most important outcome of Okinawa was what it told the world about Japan's refusal to quit, the enormous suicide strikes, the fanatical resistance on the ground, the willingness to sacrifice pilot after pilot and aircraft after aircraft in doomed attacks. It made American military planners realize that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would lead to casualties on a scale too horrifying to fully imagine. Just 6 weeks after Okinawa, the United States unleashed atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that finally brought Japan to surrender. The war that had begun at Pearl Harbor had finally reached its end. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if we'd had to invade their home islands. How many more of our boys would have died? How many more Japanese pilots would have willingly hurled themselves at our ships, determined to inflict one last blow? What we saw above Okinawa was a glimpse of what such an invasion would have been: endless bloodshed on both sides. As strange as it may sound, wiping out Japanese air power in that campaign may have saved countless lives by showing both nations that the war couldn't go on. After returning home to Ohio, I married the girl I'd loved since school and spent 4 decades flying commercial aircraft. I logged millions of miles in peaceful skies, taking travelers safely to their destinations. I never again fired a weapon in combat, but I never forgot what happened above Okinawa, nor the young men who died beside me. Every time I see a Corsair at an air show or hear the rumble of that powerful radial engine, I'm pulled back to the spring of 1945, when the air was filled with fire, and young Marines proved they would never back down. The Japanese had believed their kamikaze raids, the so-called divine wind, would change the tide of the war. They thought that willingness to die would defeat us, but they learned, as many others have, that nothing is stronger than a free people defending their homes and future. In the end, it wasn't faith or desperation that decided the outcome over Okinawa. It was American resolve, American firepower, and an unshakable will to win, no matter what it cost. The horror we experienced in those skies was unforgettable, but it marked the turning point toward peace in a war that had dragged on too long and claimed too many. We emerged victorious, but that victory came with sorrow. That's the cost of liberty. Sometimes, decent men are forced to commit terrible acts to ensure others never have to. I hope my grandchildren never face such choices. But if the day comes when they must, I want them to remember what happened in that place and find the strength to do what's necessary. The battle above Okinawa was many things: triumph, heartbreak, a shift in history's course. Asterisk, but most of all, it served as a reminder that freedom has a price, and every generation must be ready to defend it. Years may pass, and the world will surely change, but this truth remains. Some battles are won through strategy, others through pure heart. Okinawa's skies were claimed by both, and the young Americans who fought there proved that, when liberty is on the line, there are no limits to what determined people can endure and overcome. I believe the story of Okinawa isn't just about warplanes, battles, or medals. It's about the people who were there, their courage, their fear, their endurance. It's about what they gave up so that others could live in peace. Looking back, it's clear that those young men weren't just fighting to win a war, they were fighting to protect something much deeper. They were fighting so that future generations wouldn't have to. And though time moves on and memories fade, we owe it to them to remember what they did and why they did it. Because in the end, the true measure of their sacrifice isn't found in history books or old photographs. It's found in the quiet freedoms we enjoy every day, bought with the lives of those who never